Today's program has been pre-recorded, so our phone lines are not open. Well, hey there, friends. Welcome to another exciting edition of Equipped with Chris Brooks. I am absolutely thrilled that you joined us today. Why don't you do me a favor? Strap on your seatbelt. We're going to navigate through the contours of culture, as always, the lens of the biblical worldview. But before we do that, let me remind you, this is the day that the Lord has gave. He has given it as a gift so that you and I can rejoice and be glad in it. So let's do just that. Let's follow the words of the Apostle Paul. Let's rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Well, today, I'm absolutely thrilled to have a conversation really focused on leadership. Whether you're a leader in a corporate setting or a church setting, a marketplace or ministry, or you're just leading your family and want to do that well, or leading in the classroom as a teacher, or leading in another setting, we just want to encourage your heart today and help you to answer the age-old question of, how do I bring out the best in the people that I am called to lead? Maybe the greatest stewardship or responsibility that we're given as leaders is not just to make sure that the bottom line, the outcomes of the organizations that we lead is extraordinary, but that we have extraordinary influence with those that are up under our stewardship of leadership. So how do great leaders bring out the best in others? I'm glad you asked. I invited a friend along to talk about that, Dr. Tim Irwin. He is an author, a speaker, and one of the leading authorities on leadership development, organizational effectiveness, and executive selection today. Tim brings more than 20 years of consultancy in some of America's most well-respected organizations and top Fortune 100 companies. Presently, he's the managing partner of Irwin Inc., based in Atlanta and in Georgia there. And he's the New York Times bestselling author of several books, but most recently, and the one that I have in my hand now, is Extraordinary Influence: How Great Leaders Bring Out the Best in Others. He's my guest today. Tim, how are you?
Chris, it's great to be on the show, and I'm well, thank you, and I appreciate your broader definition of leaders. This is not about just corporate leaders, but it's about anybody who has an influence.
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that your book really takes that into consideration. Listen, I believe that at its best, every book is chasing a question. So I want to know, what question were you chasing when you wrote Extraordinary Influence, and how did you get to the answers you were looking for?
As you introduced this program, you mentioned the question of corporate leaders and how do we bring the best out of others. I frequently ask leadership groups, I'll have a group of people and I'll say, how many of you feel that the people in your organization are capable of contributing more than to the organization they currently are? And as you can imagine, I get about 100% yes to that. But then I ask the more difficult second question, and that is, if they're capable, then why aren't they? And what should you be doing as the leader? And this is the question that I have been plagued with. I mean, it almost keeps me up at night as I think about, how do we bring out the best in others? I was talking to a good friend who served as the head of many of the FedEx companies, and we were talking about, he uses a term called discretionary effort. What's the difference between the worker that lays the package on your steps and the worker who walks maybe 10 or 15 extra steps to make sure that package is out of the rain, or in other words, can't be seen from the street? That's discretionary effort. That's bringing out the best. And we should be thinking about that for the people that work for us, with us, our children. If we're a teacher, coach, what teacher hasn't wondered, I see that child with so much potential. How do I unlock that? How do I bring that greatness out of that child? So that's the question that drove this book and really drives me.
You know, there's a couple of things that I find to be a pleasant surprise as I engaged your book. One we'll get to later, and that is, you mentioned it, you really take careful means to expand our understanding of leadership beyond just a corporate to various spheres of life. But the other, when I think of leadership, Tim, I often think about it as a social science. But you did a great job in bringing in the best of brain science. in this equation or this conversation of how we bring out the best in others. Talk about why that's so and why you felt very committed to bringing brain science to this conversation.
Well, the brain science determines so much of how we act. It determines so much of who we are. And as we've developed these sophisticated research tools, we're able to learn more and more about the brain. Here's an example. I often ask leaders, what is the most hated event in the corporate world? And everybody just laughs. They immediately know the answer to that. And that's the performance appraisal, the annual performance appraisal. This is the subject of Dilbert cartoons. I mean, anybody who's worked in an organization who gets feedback hates that. I mean, it's just the worst thing at all. Well, if we understand it, it's because the brain tells us why. The brain is wired for safety. We have 5 times as many receptors for threatening information as we do for positive information. And so we go to that performance appraisal interview dreading it, and we're wired for safety, and it doesn't bring out the best in us. So that's an example of how so many, and I suspect many things that parents do out of frustration or anger or fatigue or any other things. I mean, I've been a parent and a grandparent. I mean, it's a challenging job, maybe the hardest job on the planet. But we say things to our children sometimes that really don't bring out the best in them.
You know, as I read through your book, one of the things that really struck me is that I think so often there's a fear among people of faith that as we consider seriously science, in this case, brain science, that somehow it's going to raise doubts about what we are taught to be true in our faith. But yet, the more I read, the more I saw how the best in modern brain science only affirms what we are taught to be true about the way God has designed us. Talk from the perspective of how your faith comes to bear on this particular project.
Well, the psalmist writes, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I mean, what God has done in creating the universe to start with, and then creating people and their complexity and just the unbelievable things that he has woven into our very being. I think it's important that we understand that. In other words, that we understand how we, in fact, are fearfully and wonderfully made. And the more, I believe, science tells us, the more it confirms who God is and what he's done. So I think this science has contributed to my faith.
You say this in your book, and I want you to unpack this a little bit more because I think this might be the punchline of it all. Anyone who runs a company, raised a family, led an army, or coached a team struggles to find the key to helping others excel and realize their potential. But here's what you say. You go on to say, it's surprising how often we resort to criticism versus an approach that actually results in better workers and a better person. So here's the punchline. It seems that the key to bringing out the best in people is actually affirmation versus criticism. Why is that so?
Well, isn't that amazing? I often ask parents to say, why do you yell at your kids? And they kind of look dumbfounded. Well, the reason parents yell at their kids is it works. In other words, you can generally get a child to do something. A coach, why do you yell at your players? Well, it works. I mean, you generally get them to move or to do whatever you're trying to get them done. It just doesn't work well, and it's not very sustainable, and it really doesn't bring out the best in the people you're trying to motivate. That's the problem. But it does have short-term consequences. I sometimes laugh at parents who say, I'm going to count to 5 and you better, and the child is controlling the parent at that moment. They're making the parent count. Well, the fact is, we now know from brain science that the brain is wired for affirmation. The thing that really brings out the best, it activates the centers of innovation, creativity, problem solving, self-control, good feelings. It comes through a result of affirmation. And it could be just saying as simply as you did a good job. The deepest affirmation is you are really becoming a wonderful person. God has blessed you. You are using his talents. You are acting with character. And I like to refer to these as words of life. And Chris, words of life reach so deeply into us. They change us, they transform us. But our world is filled with words of death. And if you ever listen to an average playground conversation on recess at a school, you'll hear mainly words of death. I mean, we're bombarded with them. And yet I'm convinced that science now has confirmed that our brains our brains thrive on affirmation.
You mentioned that this affirmation can't just be surface level. It has to speak to the core of who we are. I want to pick that up on the other side of this break because I think this sense of speaking to the core of who we are is really, really important. But let me just quickly get a definition before we go to our first break of affirmation. How are you defining that?
Well, I'm defining affirmation as conveying a positive message about that other person's behavior or their character or some aspect of that person. That's what I mean by affirmation. And it doesn't mean that we can't provide corrective feedback. In other words, you've got a young worker who's in your company and they're just starting the job. You got to help them correct. But there are ways to do that that doesn't engage that part of the brain, which immediately shuts down. We should talk about that as well.
We should. And in particular, I love to really delve into, is there a generational difference that you're seeing here in this use of punitive measures versus positive affirmation or encouragement? We're going to talk about that and much more. But my friends, I hope that you're starting to get your interest piqued. Tim has dedicated his time to plummeting the depths of current and contemporary brain science, combining that with the way that we know Scripture says we're designed to interact with individuals socially, all with an eye towards how do we bring out the best in those that we're trying to lead. And again, whether your leadership responsibility is in a corporate setting or on the church front or maybe even within the family, we want you to bring out the best of those that you are leading so they can maximize their impact and influence for Christ and his kingdom. That's our ultimate goal. My friends, I don't want you to go anywhere. As a matter of fact, these breaks are simply designed to give you an opportunity to learn more about our author, our guests, and their resource. So go to our website right now, equipradio.org. I promise you'll be happy you did. Also, our social media platforms are available to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at Equip Radio. We'll be right back right after this. Looking for the perfect gift for the young man in your life? Well, we've got just the book, 72 Questions and Answers About Life and Becoming the Man God Designed You to Be by Tim and Mark Shoemaker. It's a scripture-based guide supplemented by years of personal experience covering manhood, dating, technology, identity, faith, and so much more. Request your copy with a gift of any amount to Equip. Call 888-644-4144 or visit equipradio.org. Chris Brooks here, reminding you that today's program is pre-recorded and we won't be taking your calls. Welcome back to Equip with Chris Brooks. In your first chapter of the book, Tim Irwin, in his book Extraordinary Influence, talks about the blue suitcase phenomenon, where you go on to argue that many leaders create an effect they did not intend. Can you unpack that a little bit for us, Tim?
Well, that's exactly right. Leaders are trying to get a job done, and it's not an easy job. We're trying to get our companies to run better, or churches to be more effective, or our teams or our classroom, whatever it is where we have influence. And very often in our seeking to improve the behavior of those around us, we resort to short-term methods that don't bring out the best. I have tried to, and I mean this in a funny sense, but in some ways I'd like to see it happen. I've tried to start a worldwide effort to ban the phrase constructive criticism. I mean, that is the ultimate oxymoron, constructive criticism. There's nothing constructive about it. Now, I do think we have to correct. A coach has to tell a lineman how to move to a different position to make a better block and so on. But that's more about information. It's not about yelling and screaming. And so I think very often we, in the feedback that we give our children or leaders, we often engage a part of the brain that shuts down the part of the brain we want to reach. It makes somebody feel very unsafe.
You're an organizational psychologist, Tim, and you have spent a lot of time thinking about the soft skills. But yet you caution against the thought of being a task-driven leader. What do you mean by that? The thought of looking beyond just a task?
Obviously, the organization exists for a purpose, and it's to accomplish its mission. And that often involves a lot of tasks. It involves analyzing financial data or getting sales or delivering a service, whatever that organization might do. But the workplace is very interpersonal. And I find that most organizations don't struggle to deliver the task. They struggle to work together, to work on teams, or to be collaborative, to resolve conflict. That's where the rub is. And that's really what I try and focus on, is helping organizations function better in that arena.
Now apply that insight to, let's just say, the family.
Well, everybody knows that children squabble. I mean, that's just goes with the territory. And so to the extent that parents can learn to bring out the best in others, they've got to learn to help children collaborate. And that's one reason I love children's sports, is I think they teach them about being on a team, learning that you have to work with someone else to achieve a particular result. But when parents yell at their children, when they scream at them, they're engaging a part of the brain we call the amygdala. The amygdala is a part of the brain which is constantly on threat alert. It's asking the question, am I safe? And once that part of the brain gets engaged through a parent yelling, or a coach screaming at a child, or a corporate leader giving this criticism through a performance management process, whatever it might be, it tends to set off the amygdala. And when that amygdala is engaged, when its neurons are firing, it shuts down access to the parts of the brain that we most want to reach, the part of the brain that's positive and the part of it that's good at problem solving and innovative and creative. So I think parents need to learn to motivate their children, if you will, with affirmation whenever positive.
So I want to talk about how affirmation really can get to the core of who we are, but I think it's important for us to define it first. You refer to this sense of speaking to the core of a person throughout your book. What do you mean by that?
Well, Chris, I'm going to ask you a personal question. Do you talk to yourself?
All the time. I try not to answer myself, but I'm constantly having a conversation with myself.
Well, we all do. I mean, we all talk to ourselves. And really, I think it's a very healthy thing to learn to listen to that internal dialogue, because we often find things that we really want to change. But there's a person living inside us. In other words, and we speak more words to ourselves than we do to others, probably 2 or 3 times as many. Scientists tell us anyway. And so that person inside us is our core. It's the core of who we are. It's that person inside. We also have that external self, that part of us that interacts with the others around us or interacts with the people that we deal with every day. But that core is where we as people really live. And that's, we could go and we could define this theologically if you wanted to, but it's really that person inside us. And that's where affirmation has to reach. Now, I'm not saying a parent can't say to a child, hey, honey, thanks for cleaning up the kitchen. You did a really nice job. You got everything done. You got the dishwasher loaded and things look great. Thank you so much. That's a task. I mean, we should affirm that. But saying to a child, sweetheart, I appreciate so much the way you reached out to your sister. She was crying. She felt hurt. Her friend had hurt her feelings. And you went over and you spoke to her and encouraged her and said everything would be all right. That was an amazing thing for her to do, and to affirm that inner person in that way is very transformational. It brings about the most positive changes we can imagine. The Bible says that words of life are like golden apples in a silver basket.
Yeah.
Just think about the picture. They're beautiful. I mean, they enrich us. They're beautiful. And Paul writes, let your words be seasoned as they were with salt, that they may give help or benefit to all who hear. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about, affirming the core, where we reach into another person's life and affirm them at a deep level.
Yeah, a lot of us were brought up under, and I'm speaking a lot to men right now when I say this generalization, but a lot of us were brought up under a macho management style, or at least we were those were set as examples before us. Maybe in sports, you see the coach who's hyper aggressive and taking on that macho management style. How much does this kind of cut against the grain of that when you talk about becoming more of a leader that uses the tool of affirmation as opposed to that macho management approach?
I read a wonderful article recently about coaching, and more coaches are turning to a different style of coaching. Historically, coaches have been tough. They've screamed at their players. They've made them do laps or any number of things. And what coaches are finding is that they're better as teachers. In other words, teaching players how to play their position. And I think that's a change, a good change that's occurring and I believe that works with our children too. When we deal with our children calmly, we deal with them as parents who are trying to teach them a better way to be or a better way to live or a better way to handle something. I think that is more effective. But the same thing has occurred in the corporate world. I mean, a lot of people came out of World War II and had been in a very military environment where leaders were tough and forceful and demanding. But over time, I think leaders have found they get better results when they're more affirming.
Let's talk about this from a generational perspective, because I lead here at our church 3 generations of people, at least 3 generations now, really 4, baby boomers, Gen Xers, millennials, now Gen Z is emerging. How have you found this type of leadership wisdom to be uniquely beneficial as you look at the generational spectrum?
Well, undoubtedly there are differences, but I think in some ways they're accentuated too much. And what I find is that affirmation is a human need. It doesn't matter whether you're 70 or 10. In other words, affirmation is something when we speak in such a way that honors that other person, it really brings out the best. I just wrote a Happy Father's Day note to one of my sons, and I was just affirming him for his character and what a fine man he is. And he's a millennial, but I think that message is what he needs to hear. He needs to know that he is highly valued by his dad.
It's interesting. One of my favorite Bible teachers, pastors, is Chuck Swindoll. During his time as the president of Dallas Theological Seminary, he tells the story of a professor who was one of the best research professors really in the world. He had received all of these great accolades and awards for his research in biblical theology. And he was approaching the age of 70 and was getting ready to retire, Tim. And Chuck was asked to speak at his retirement. Now, this was a man who had received, awards the world over. And what Chuck decided to do at his retirement was simply to give him affirmation, to talk more about who he was as a person, to share almost like fatherly words of love and appreciation. And the man wept like a baby. And it seemed that this was what he needed more than another plaque, another award for New Testament or Old Testament studies. Are you surprised when you hear stories like that?
Well, not at all, because that is exactly what happens when we affirm a person in their core. And again, I'm not diminishing the value of saying, hey, you did a good job, or that was a fine article you wrote, Dr. So-and-so, or you really had an amazing impact on students. But when you reach into their core, I find that people often do cry. I mean, it just reaches a part of their soul that is hard to reach. And that affirmation goes so deep. And when you talk about what that person's life, about how wise they've been or how much they've done for others, it reaches the deepest possible level of that individual. That's what God's love does. I mean, when we read in Scripture about God's love for us, I mean, we should be weeping. I mean, we should be weeping out of gratitude and moved that God could love us. He demonstrates his own love toward us, that while we were yet sinners, his son died for us. I mean, the love is just incomprehensible.
I'm always blessed when I hear terms of endearment that the Lord uses throughout Scripture. They're extraordinary, even in the times when he has to discipline a nation of Israel or even us. Scripture often he uses terms that are terms of love, a father speaking to a beloved child, reminding us that we are those that he has redeemed and that he loves with an everlasting and eternal love. Hey, when we come back, we're going to talk about how we can have extraordinary influence on those we lead. Don't go anywhere. Much more to come with Dr. Tim Irwin next on Equip. Chris Brooks here, reminding you that today's program is pre-recorded. While we won't be taking calls, we do want to connect with you on social media. Welcome back to Equip with Chris Brooks. I'm having a wonderful conversation with Dr. Tim Irwin, best-selling author, consultant, and one of the leading authorities on leadership development and organizational effectiveness. Today we're talking about his book, Extraordinary Influence, how great leaders bring out the best in others. I would encourage you highly to add this to your library. You can find out more by going to our website, equipradio.org. If you're a leader in a corporate setting or a church setting, whether it's a family or a team, one of the great tasks and stewardship responsibilities we have before us is to bring out the best in the people we lead. How do you do that? Well, you might be surprised at how the best of social science, understanding how God has designed us, and brain science really helps us to get to a place where we understand how words of affirmation, positive words of encouragement that speak to our core are actually better at producing the results we desire than the effects of a punitive environment. Dr. Tim Irwin helps to unpack that for us in this extraordinary book. I'm encouraging you to go to our website as well as our social media platforms to learn more. Tim, I actually lead a church that uses performance evaluations as one of our feedback tools. And as I read through your book, I now begin to question whether or not those, though well-intended, produce the intended results that we hope. Talk about performance evaluations and your thoughts on the use of them.
Fortunately, many large companies are starting to discover that they can do a better job in this area. The traditional performance management form that the employee fills out and maybe the boss fills out and they compare notes and so on really isn't that effective. And one of my clients has started a program where they call them performance chats. And that's where the boss just walks around, meets with people somewhat informally and says, hey, how do you feel this went? What do you think we need to do to improve it? And performance, the problem with a performance appraisal process is it's very often done only once a year. Yeah. And a person could have solved world peace in January, and by December, the boss says, what's your name? I mean, it's amazing. And so I think performance feedback needs to be part of our daily, weekly involvement with people. And filling out a form once a year really doesn't set people up for success. Incidentally, and if I were listening to this interview, Chris, that you and I are doing this morning, I would listen and think, I would be skeptical. I'd say, well, you got to tell people they're not doing this right. They're messing up. And I get that. I interviewed about 50 CEOs of very large companies. And one of the questions I asked them was, what boss did you have along the way that you think made the biggest contribution to your now being in this job that you have, the CEO of this huge Fortune 25 company? And I was stunned at the frequency with which I got pretty much the same answer. And a person would say, oh boy, I remember so-and-so, and man, she was so hard on me. I mean, she would expect me to, work through the night, or, she was demanding, and she gave me really tough feedback. But you know what? I never doubted, even for a second, that she was for me, that deep down she wanted my best, that she really wanted me to excel. And Chris, listen, we serve a God of excellence. And shouldn't we be striving for that? I mean, I think God has designed excellence into everything that He's done. And I think that we should be seeking that as well. And so we should be striving for that. We should be seeking to do that. And that's what these CEOs were saying, is that people were tough on them. They gave them tough feedback in some cases, but that they were fundamentally really seeking the best interests of that person. They were seeking to bring out the best, and they knew that person could do better. They knew they could be more excellent.
Tim, what is intrinsic motivation?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a term that's been used a lot over the years. But basically, I think that's let's talk about extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is where somebody from the outside is seeking to motivate you or change you or motivate you to do something, maybe a teacher, a parent, or whatever. But at some point, we hope the onboard engines take over, the engines that are inside that person. And that's intrinsic motivation, where we learn that I need to be responsible for my own performance. And that's where intrinsic motivation. And I remember when that switch was thrown in myself, it was toward the end of college. I remembered I just decided, I heard a great Christian leader speak, and I said, I really want to make an impact with my life. And I'm going to try and start to do things in a way that lead to excellence.
I want to turn the tables on you. You've interviewed so many. I want to ask you the question, who was the best leader you worked for and why?
Well, that's a great question. And I've interviewed over 10,000 leaders over the years. And by the way, that's an old bio. It said 20 years. That's up to about 30 now. But so anyway, I've interviewed many great leaders. And some of those people were people of faith. Some were not. But they had an ability to bring out the best. And they were not often charismatic people. They were people that were willful, though, but they were often, like Jim Collins says, they were humble. They had a certain humility, and they realized that this is not about me. It's about our company. It's about the people here. And that's typically what I find in these great leaders is they're not seeking personal gain as much as they are for the organization, for the church, for the people, and so on.
You want us to really move beyond another term that I would have you to define. Can you define for us tactical influence and why we should look to move beyond that?
Well, tactical influence is what we referred to earlier is affirming someone's style or their decisions, their actions. Hey, I was really glad to see that you involved your colleague over in the ABC department. I think that was smart. You've gotten their buy-in on this. You're getting their support and help. That was just a good move on your part. The strategic affirmation is where we are very, very intentional and thoughtful. And this is where with a child, we don't just sort of do it. I mean, certainly we can do it spontaneously, but where we're thoughtful, what am I trying to do to bring out the best in that child or in that worker or that colleague of mine? And so that's where we affirm the core. We go deep. And that's where those CEOs said, I knew she was really for me. I knew that the things that she said, she would say things to me like, look, you are incredibly gifted. You should have my job. In other words, you should be doing what I'm doing because you have the talent, you have the ability, and you have the character to move into the position. And so my goal is to help you get ready for that. And that's what that strategic affirmation is about. And that's what really transforms people. It's not that the other isn't valuable, but the strategic really changes a person, changes a child, changes a player, changes a worker.
What I found, Tim, is that the more I have self-awareness, the better I am at giving affirmation. Is there a connection there?
Listen, there is no question. In fact, I'm about to share a very frightening thought. I did a study some years ago and wrote a book called Derailed. Mm-hmm. And in that book, I studied leaders that derailed. In other words, they failed in their jobs. They were fired by their boards. These were often CEOs. I profiled 6 well-known CEOs who've been fired by their boards. And do you know what the number one problem was? The common denominator was they lacked self-awareness. And I think we need to become more self-aware. I'm not talking about being narcissistic and constantly thinking about myself first, but I'm saying thinking about how God has made me, thinking about the areas where I need to be particularly concerned, where I may be more vulnerable to falling. And that's where self-awareness is very, very important for any person that wants to influence others.
Man, you talk about vulnerabilities, and this is one of the areas where I think a lot of leaders struggle. I don't care if you're a parent, you're a teacher, you're a coach, again, you're a pastor, you're a CEO. Why are we so afraid at being vulnerable?
You know, Chris, that's a great question, and I sort of go to my default answer. It's the fall. You know, it's that we're sinful. You know, and we're reluctant to really open up, to be transparent to others, to let people know where I'm less than adequate or where I'm in sin. I encourage pastors. I mean, pastors are especially vulnerable in my sense because they don't have good friends. I mean, they don't have people they can be open with. They have to be the perfect individual. And I think those people are, in some ways, are the most vulnerable to derailment. Pastors derail too, by the way.
How do we overcome that? How do we overcome the fear of vulnerability?
Well, I think it's through building trusting relationships. And, I'm in an accountability group. I meet with some other guys, and we ask each other really hard questions. And there's an expectation that, we're safe here, and that you don't hold back. I mean, that you absolutely share what's going on with you, and you get the input from the others. But it's a safe place. It's a trusting. Yeah. And I find, since we're talking about pastors, a lot of pastors don't have that. It's certainly not their elder board or their deacons. I mean, that's not a safe place necessarily. But having 3 or 4 close friends, maybe fellow pastors, is a really big idea. And then just being willing to take the risk to say, guys, hey, I'm struggling. I don't like my wife right now. She said some things to me and I'm mad at her and I need help to get reestablished in my fellowship with her, or whatever might be the case.
It's really interesting that you bring this up, because I think that everything you're saying about pastors is true. Everything you're saying about the need to have a core of safe friends and relationships is absolutely on point. But I also will add this, that I think probably our greatest task as leaders is to create psychological safe places, to create a safe place for people to feel comfortable sharing. Because I can't tell you how many times I've looked up and I've said to myself, as a person maybe has exited, or maybe they've blown it within the moral aspects of their responsibilities within our church, I've said to myself, how did I miss that? Chris, how did you miss that? And it seems to go back to not did I ask the question, how you doing? Obviously, we've asked that question again and again and again, but it seems to go back to, did we create a safe enough place for people to be honest? And that to me, Tim, seems to be a great struggle.
Well, Chris, you've hit the nail on the head. And this is about creating individual safety with an individual. And again, the brain is wired for this. And, I hope someday to be able to ask the Lord to unpack this for me more, but the brain is wired for safety. And if we go into a new situation, or the minute they walk in the doors of that church, we're all asking a question: am I safe today? And so we have to learn to not only create individual safety with another person, but I think churches and organizations have to create a culture of safety, that you're here, that, and that people can speak up. You can say things that are contrary to the norm, and that's okay. And I believe pastors have a huge role in making their church a safe place to be authentic, to be real, to be really who I am, and to show where I'm struggling.
Yeah, it's not always easy, but if the general is going to get the right answer from those that he's leading, if the CEO is going to get the right answer from those that she's leading, if the pastor is going to get the right answer from the leaders that they are responsible for, you have to create psychological safe places so that people can answer the question, yes, to am I safe? And hopefully Tim's book will help us to get there. I can't recommend this book highly enough. If you're a leader who is looking for how other leaders are bringing out the best in those that they have surrounded themselves with, Tim's book gets us a long way there. How do you have extraordinary influence? I know I want it. Maybe you do as well. Find out more at our website, equipradio.org. Now, I've asked Tim to stick around for this final segment, so we're going to take this short break. But again, it gives you opportunity to learn more about our guests and about our resource. So please do it. Social media is available to you right now. Go to Equip Radio. Whatever you do, stick and stay. We'll be right back right after this. In today's rapidly changing culture, Christians need solid biblical guidance more than ever. That's our mission here at Equip, to provide biblical wisdom for life's toughest questions. When you step in as an equipper, you're not just giving. Your monthly support helps to offer clarity and hope to a confused and anxious culture. And you'll get exclusive resources and updates from us all year long. Join our team of monthly supporters today. Call 888-644-4144 or visit equipradio.org. Navigating manhood comes with questions, and thankfully, God's Word has answers. 72 questions and answers about life and becoming the man God designed you to be is a biblical guidebook that tackles the real questions young men face today about dating, identity, technology, pornography, faith, and so much more. You can request your copy or get one for someone you know with a gift of any amount to Equip. Simply call 888-644-4144 or visit equipradio.org. Welcome back to Equip with Chris Brooks. Tim Irwin is my guest today. Extraordinary Influence is the book. How great leaders bring out the best in others. All right, Tim, you have successfully arrived at the rapid fire round. I'm going to throw out a few questions. Maybe you can give your best, brief, well thought through answers. But let's talk about two things that I think are really important. Why did you include a chapter here that is dedicated to teachers, to parents beyond the boardroom, if you will?
Well, these are people of huge influence in our lives. We've all had parents, teachers, et cetera, who had tremendous influence, and I wanted to say a word to them about how they bring out the best in the people that they lead.
I think it's critical, and I would highly commend that chapter of the book for those who say, man, my influence is not so much in the boardroom, but it is yet and still very important. And I know as a pastor who leads the church, that churches are really the story of families writ large. And I want to see the families of our church do well. And I would highly encourage you to pick up Tim's book. There's much value there. What about brain science have we not talked about that you feel like is an important aspect of this book?
Well, I think we're discovering new things every year about the brain and how wonderfully and fearfully God has in fact made us. But I think that there is a longing in all of us for purpose. And I think this comes out of how God created, that we long to make a difference. We long for our lives to count. And I think there's a restlessness in us that's wired in our brains. And I can't point to a specific part of the brain where that resides, but I think that's an overarching need for who we are. And it comes straight out of our brain. It's not only a need for safety that we've been talking about, more importantly, it's a need for significance. And I think your listeners should be thoughtful about this. How can I make a difference? Somebody in your life needs to hear words of life. They've come through a tough time. I mean, they've had, and I can't even imagine all the things that they faced. But what I'm saying is that somebody needs words of life. And I hope you will be thoughtful, intentional. Think about today. Who needs words of life? Maybe it's my wife, or maybe it's my child, or maybe it's somebody I'm working with, somebody at work. But be thoughtful, be intentional, be strategic, and give that person words of life, because that has diminished over these last months. That's the way I would respond to what we've been through.
You know, James, the book of James, chapter 1, verse 13, talks about how God uses adversity for the good. Romans 8:28 tells us that as well. You talk about this in your book. What do you want us to know about how adversity plays a key role in helping people to grow?
Well, adversity is clearly linked to personal growth and resilience. I mean, that is a biblical principle, which is unmistakable. In fact, one of the things that I see parents, a mistake that I would think parents make sometimes, is they try and insulate their children from the very things that will make that person stronger. And we have to be thoughtful. Sometimes we do have to step in and help a child and shield them from certain things. But I'm saying also that let them experiencing hardship can sometimes make them the person that God
Yes.
really wants them to be.
And Tim, I would just expand that. I think that what I find to be true about me and about many others is not only are we trying to maybe disproportionately insulate our family, our children from adversity, I think it's true as well for our organizations that we lead. And maybe although adversity brings some challenges for certain, there are also extraordinary benefits for us to positively influence those that we lead and bring out the best in them. And Tim, you've just done an extraordinary job of putting together this book, and I just want to thank you for taking out time to share some of your time-tested wisdom and helping us to think through well how to bring out the best in those that we lead. Bless you, Tim.
Thank you, Chris, and blessings to you, and thank you for all the great influence that you have out there in the world and for your wonderful talks and your ministry. Thank you for that.
So appreciate you, my friend. Hey, folks, if you want to lead in a way that brings out the best in others, if you want to expand your influence in the lives of those that God has placed in your stewardship and care, I want to encourage you to pick up Dr. Tim Irwin's wonderful book, Extraordinary Influence, How Great Leaders Bring Out the Best in Others. You can find out more at our website, equipradio.org. Until we're together again, remember, Equip with Chris Brooks is a production of Moody Radio, a ministry of Moody Bible Institute.